He didn't need a wife. He needed someone who could milk 16 cows before dawn without complaining, patch a fence line in freezing mud, and not run screaming back to town after the first hard week. What Colton Hayes got instead was a woman who showed up on his failing doorstep with 2 worn leather bags, looked straight at the worst ranch in Harlan County, and smiled like she'd just found exactly what she was looking for. This is the story of a man who was 3 weeks from losing everything his father ever built, and the woman nobody believed in who refused to let it die. Stay with me until the very end, because this one is going to surprise you. If this story moves you, hit the like button and drop a comment with the city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far these stories travel, and if you haven't subscribed yet, join our family so you never miss what comes next. The advertisement was embarrassing. Colton knew it before he even handed it to Merle Duggan at the post office, and he knew it again 3 days later when he saw it tacked up on the board outside the feed store, right next to a notice for a missing mule and an offer to buy scrap iron. Wanted. A capable woman willing to work a dairy ranch. Must know cattle. Marriage offered in exchange for honest labor and a fair share of whatever comes of this place. No romantic notions required. Respond to Colton Hayes, Box 7, Harlan Creek, Wyoming Territory. No romantic notions required. He'd written that part twice and kept it both times. He wasn't interested in pretending this was something it wasn't. The ranch needed hands. He needed someone to stay. Those were the facts. What he didn't say in the advertisement, what he couldn't say without sounding like a man already beaten, was that the dairy barn roof was rotting in 3 places, that the south pasture fence had been down since August, that he'd lost 2 hired men to better wages at the Callaway spread, and that the bank in Millhaven had sent him a letter the previous month with language cold enough to frost a window pane in July. We regret to inform you that without significant improvement in your outstanding debt balance by the 1st of March, we will be compelled to begin foreclosure proceedings on the property known as the Hayes homestead. He'd folded that letter and put it under a coffee tin on the kitchen shelf, like putting something out of sight could keep it from being true. The Hayes homestead sat 12 miles east of Harlan Creek on a stretch of rolling grassland that his father, Gerald Hayes, had broken with his own hands in 1861. Gerald had been a stubborn man, the kind who would rather bleed than admit a thing couldn't be done, and Colton had inherited that stubbornness in full. What he hadn't inherited was his father's luck, or his father's ability to find good people and keep them. Gerald Hayes had a gift for making men feel like their work meant something. Colton mostly made them feel like they weren't doing enough of it. By October of 1888, the ranch that Gerald had called his proudest achievement looked like a place that had given up. The dairy barn, which had once housed 30 milking cows in respectable condition, held 16, and half of those were thin from a summer that had been too dry and too expensive to compensate for. The hay supply was worrying. The breeding records, 3 journals his father had kept in near obsessive detail, sat in a wooden crate in the corner of the house because Colton had never learned to read them properly and had never wanted to admit it. He was 31 years old, and he was tired in a way that sleep didn't fix. That was the condition of the man who posted the advertisement. He got 4 responses over the following 2 weeks. The first was from a widow in Nebraska who wrote with excellent penmanship and asked 7 detailed questions about the house, none of which were about the cattle. He didn't write back. The second was from a woman named Clara Finch, who arrived on the Tuesday stage, took one look at the yard from the road, turned to the driver and said, "Keep going." The driver told that story at the saloon for a week. The third was a letter that turned out to be from a man named Horace Pittman, who had apparently misread the advertisement or was hoping for something Colton couldn't help him with. The fourth was Abigail Rowan. Her letter was short, and it said almost nothing about herself, which Colton noticed because most letters like this said too much. She didn't describe her appearance or her cooking or whether she was a cheerful sort of person in the mornings. She said she was 27, that she'd worked dairy operations in Kansas and 2 seasons in the Colorado Hill Country, that she understood cattle breeding records and could shoe a horse in a pinch, and that she was available to travel at 2 weeks' notice if the position was still open. At the bottom of the letter, in handwriting slightly smaller than the rest, she'd added, "I'm not looking for easy. I'm looking for something worth working for." Colton read that line 3 times. Then he wrote back and told her to come. She arrived on a Thursday, the second week of November, on the afternoon stage from Laramie. Colton had driven the wagon into town to collect her, which he'd already told himself was a practical decision and nothing more. He didn't know what he was expecting. Something worn down, maybe. Someone who looked like she'd taken this offer because there weren't better ones, which would have been a fair assessment of the situation. Abigail Rowan stepped off the stage with 2 leather bags and a canvas roll tied with rope, and she was nothing he'd expected and hard to describe in the moment, because he was trying too hard to look like he wasn't looking. She was medium height, dark-haired, with the kind of hands that told you right away she hadn't spent the last decade in a parlor. Her coat was practical wool, good quality once, but worn at the cuffs. She had a straight, direct way of looking at things, the street, the buildings, the wagon, like she was already taking notes. She spotted him before he said anything, which he found slightly irritating. "Mr. Hayes," she said, more statement than question. "Miss Rowan." He took the canvas roll from her without asking if she wanted him to. Stage was late. 40 minutes. Loose wheel on the back axle. The driver noticed it outside of Cutter's Bend, but decided it would hold. She said this without judgment, like she was simply reporting relevant information. They loaded her bags into the wagon, and Colton climbed up to the seat. She climbed up on the other side before he thought to offer a hand, which saved them both an awkward moment. They drove out of Harlan Creek without saying much, which suited him fine. She looked at the landscape with that same attentive expression, tracking the terrain, the fence lines along the road, the condition of the cattle visible in the distance on neighboring spreads. After about 4 miles, she asked a question that caught him sideways. "What's your water situation?" "I've got the creek, runs year-round except in bad droughts. Got a well for the house." "Spring-fed or dug?" "Dug, 40 feet." "That's good." She nodded like she was filing it away. "The spread I worked in Colorado lost 3 seasons to a spring that failed. Took the owner 2 years to figure out it wasn't his herd causing the problem." Colton glanced at her. "You know what killed his herd?" "Bad water made the milk go sour. He blamed the cows, I blamed the water. We argued about it for most of one winter." A pause. "He wasn't a man who liked being wrong." "What happened?" "He dug a new well, and his milk improved, and he still never said I was right." She said it the same way she said everything, level, without bitterness, like that was just a thing that happened to people and you made note of it and moved on. Colton didn't say anything for a moment. Then, "I don't have a problem admitting when I'm wrong." "That's useful to know," Abigail said. He couldn't tell if she believed him. "My mom's Sam." He'd decided on the drive into town that he would show her the house first, give her a chance to see where she'd be living before throwing the disaster of the barn at her. He had cleaned the kitchen that morning, which had taken longer than it should have because it had been in a condition that would have embarrassed a man with less pressing concerns. But when they turned up the lane toward the property and the dairy barn came into view first, Abigail was already looking at it. She was quiet for a long moment. "The roof," she said. "It's on my list. It's past the list. That center beam is bowing." She tilted her head slightly. "How long has it been like that?" "Since spring." "You've been milking under that?" "I've been milking under that," Colton said, with exactly the flatness of a man who knew how that sounded. She didn't say anything sharp. She didn't say anything at all for a moment. Then, "What do you want to show me first, the cattle or the house?" He'd planned to say the house. What came out was the cattle. She nodded like that was the right answer. He tied off the horse at the post, and they walked toward the barn together. The smell hit them when he pulled the door open. Hay and manure and the warm animal smell of the cows, which were doing what cows do in the afternoon, standing around looking vaguely miserable in the particular way cows have perfected over centuries. Abigail walked in slowly. She didn't rush to look at one thing. She took in the whole space first, the way you do when you're actually reading a place instead of just looking at it. Then she started moving down the line. She checked ears, checked hooves, looked at body condition with her hand on a hip or along a flank, occasionally lifting a lip to check teeth. She didn't narrate while she was doing it, which Colton appreciated. He'd had men come out to look at his herd and talk the whole time, using words as a screen in front of what they were actually seeing. She stopped at the 7th cow in the line, a big raw-boned roan with a white patch on her left ear, that Colton's father had named Duchess, though the name had always struck Colton as a cruel joke. Abigail stood there for a long moment. "She's got a quarter that's been giving trouble," Colton said. "Had mastitis in the spring. She's never come back to full production on that side." Abigail crouched down and looked at the udder carefully, then stood. "She was your best producer before the mastitis." It wasn't a question, but Colton answered anyway. "She was." "Have you got her breeding records?" "My father kept records. I've got 3 journals somewhere." Something shifted in Abigail's expression. Just slightly. 3 journals. He was thorough, Colton said, with the complicated feeling a man gets talking about a dead father he respected but hadn't always understood. Abigail looked at him. "Can I see them tonight?" He said yes before he'd thought about it clearly, which he later decided was probably when the trouble started. Not the bad kind of trouble, but the kind that rearranges things. They ate supper that first night at the kitchen table with the 3 journals open between them and the lamp turned up as far as it would go. Colton had made salt pork and boiled potatoes, which was what he made most nights because it required very little thought and he had precious little to spare. He'd set out 2 plates without discussion. That part, at least, had not been awkward. Abigail ate without commenting on the food, which was either polite or damning. He wasn't sure which. She was already reading the first journal before she was halfway through her plate. He watched her read, which he tried to do without making it obvious. She had a way of running her finger down the column of notes, his father's cramped, tilted script, and stopping occasionally to look at something twice. Her brow would pull together slightly, then it would smooth out, then pull together again. "Your father tracked the lineage going back 4 generations on these cows," she said without looking up. "He was meticulous." "He wasn't meticulous. He was obsessed." She turned a page. Mr. Hayes, this is an extraordinary record. Most ranchers couldn't tell you their bull's mother's name. Your father could tell you her milk production in the 3rd winter and what she weighed at 2 years. Colton looked at his potatoes. He thought it mattered more than most people allowed. "It does." She looked up at him then. "That's why your herd is still alive, even though your ranch has been struggling for—" She paused, seemed to make a decision about how far to push. "For some time." "You can say it," Colton said. "It's struggling because I've been running it wrong." Abigail said nothing for a moment. Then, "You've been running it alone." "Same thing, some days." She looked at him for a beat too long, then back at the journal. "No, it's not the same thing. Running it wrong means you made bad decisions. Running it alone means you were making decisions that needed 2 people with information you only had half of." She tapped the journal. "This information. Your father didn't just track these cows because he liked writing things down. He was building something. A bloodline specific to this land, this elevation, this winter severity. These cows aren't thin because they're weak. They're thin because they've been stressed, undersupported, and you've been selling off the wrong animals to cover costs." Colton set down his fork. "What do you mean the wrong animals?" She slid the journal across the table and pointed to a row of entries. "These 3 you sold last spring, to Callaway. I needed the money. They were the ones I could get the best price for. Because they were your largest, your best conditioned." She said it quietly. "You sold your strongest breeding stock and kept the marginal animals." He stared at the page. "The thing about being told something you already suspected somewhere deep down is that it doesn't feel like new information. It feels like something being dragged into the light where you have to deal with it." "The banker in Millhaven told me to thin the herd and get cash quick," he said finally. "I know what bankers say." "You got a different suggestion?" Abigail closed the journal carefully. She looked at him across the lamp. Her face in that light was serious and a little tired, the kind of tired that comes from being capable in a world that keeps arguing with capable women about whether they know what they're talking about. "The suggestion I have," she said, "is going to sound like I've lost my mind." "Tell me anyway." She told him. He listened to the whole thing without interrupting, which was harder than it sounded, because the plan she was laying out, stop selling the breeding herd, rotate the south pasture properly, survive the winter on tight rations and the revenue from the existing milk production, then push hard in spring, sounded like the kind of plan a person made when they'd rather lose big than lose small. It required discipline. It required faith in the cattle that the cattle would have to earn. It required getting through a Wyoming winter without margin. When she finished, Colton leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment. "The banker's going to call the note if I don't show improvement by March," he said. "Then we need to show improvement a different way than selling what you can't replace. You think these cows can do it? I think your father built something here that you don't fully realize yet." She pulled the third journal toward her. "This line of cattle, this specific group, your father crossed a Durham bull with stock that came from a spread in the Montana high country. Animals that had already been selected for brutal winters. The offspring in this journal," she flipped to a page toward the back, "produced consistently through the winter of 1881, one of the worst on record for this region, while neighboring operations were losing half their herds." Colton was quiet. "You've been running them like ordinary dairy cattle," Abigail continued. "They're not. They're something better than that. And the reason you don't know it is because you haven't had anyone to read these records with you." He said nothing for a moment. Outside, the wind had picked up, throwing cold fingers against the windows the way it did in November, testing the frame, reminding you it would be back and worse. "You just got here," he said. "I know. You've been on this property for 4 hours. 3.5. He looked at her. "And you're telling me you figured out what I've been doing wrong in 3.5 hours. Abigail Rowan didn't smile or soften it. "I'm telling you what the records say. You can disagree with me. That's your right. It's your ranch." "It is," Colton said. "But you asked for a capable woman," she said, "not a woman who'd keep her mouth shut." There was a silence between them that wasn't uncomfortable, exactly, but had weight to it. "Show me the hardest job first," he'd asked her in his letter. No, wait. He hadn't asked that. She'd said something on arrival, hadn't she? He tried to remember the exact moment she'd stepped down from that stage. No, it was the barn. It was... "You said that," he said suddenly, "when we came out to the barn." "What?" "You said, 'Show me the hardest job first.' That's what you said when I asked what you wanted to see." Abigail looked at him mildly puzzled. "I always say that." "Why?" She considered the question with more seriousness than he'd expected. "Because the hardest job is where you find out if you actually want to do the work," she said, "or if you just like the idea of it." Colton looked at his father's journals spread across the table. At 16 cows, that might be more valuable than anyone had given them credit for. At the lamp that was burning lower and would need trimming before long. He'd placed that advertisement because he needed someone to milk the cows and keep the place from dying. He hadn't thought much past that. He thought past it now, sitting in his dead father's kitchen with the wind outside and a woman across the table who read cattle journals, the way other people read letters from someone they loved, carefully, with attention, like the words meant something. "We start early tomorrow," he said. "The dairy schedule's been irregular. That's the first thing I want fixed." Abigail nodded and began stacking the journals in order. "I'll need to walk the south pasture at first light before the dairy work starts." "The south pasture's a mess." "I know. That's why I want to see it first." She stood and gathered the journals into a neat pile, then looked at him. "I'll be up at 4:30. I'm usually up at 4. "Then I'll see you at 4, she said. And she picked up the journals and took them with her toward the room he'd cleared out at the back of the house, the one that had been his father's study, because it had a window on the east side, and he'd thought, for reasons he hadn't examined too closely, that she'd want to see the light come up in the morning. He sat at the table alone for a while after she'd gone, listening to the house settle around him and the wind work at the corners of the roof. Then he blew out the lamp and went to bed. He didn't sleep for a long time, but that was nothing new. What was new was that for the first time in a year, the thing keeping him awake wasn't dread. He wasn't sure yet what it was, but it was something else entirely. She was up before 4. Colton heard her moving in the back room. Not loudly, just the creak of floorboards under careful feet, the sound of someone who'd spent years in other people's houses and had learned not to disturb the walls. He was already dressed and had the stove going when she came out, her hair pinned back and her coat on, the third journal tucked under her arm like she'd been reading it by whatever early light she could find. She looked at the coffee on the stove, then at him. "You said 4, she said. "I said I was usually up at 4. Didn't say I waited." She poured herself a cup without asking if that was all right. He didn't mind. He'd already decided he wouldn't mind things like that, because minding small things was a luxury a man in his position couldn't afford, and because something about the way she moved through the kitchen, direct, without fuss, not taking up too much space, but not apologizing for being there either, made the minding feel beside the point. They went out into the dark together. The cold hit like a door slamming. November in that part of Wyoming didn't negotiate. It was simply cold, the kind that got into your collar immediately and stayed there. And the ground was hard enough underfoot that each step made a sound. The sky to the east was not yet thinking about light. The dairy barn was a black shape against a black sky, and somewhere in it one of the cows made a low sound, the particular complaint of an animal that had been awake longer than the humans coming to tend her. Abigail stopped in the yard and stood still for a moment. "How long since you ran a proper morning schedule?" she asked. Not accusatory, just asking. "Consistent schedule fell apart in July when I lost both hands. So, 5 months of irregular milking." "About that." She exhaled, and in the cold, her breath made a small cloud. "That explains the production drop more than the feed situation does. Dairy cattle have long memories for routine. Disrupt the schedule and their bodies slow down. It's not stubbornness. It's just how they're built." "I know that," Colton said, more sharply than he intended. "I know you know it," she said. "I'm just saying it out loud so we're starting from the same place." He didn't respond, and they walked to the barn. What happened over the next 2 hours was not dramatic. It was just work. The ordinary, physical, cold-handed work of a dairy operation before sunrise, which has no glamour in it and asks nothing of you except to show up and do it correctly. But Colton found himself watching her between his own tasks, not because he was unused to having someone else in the barn, but because the way she worked was different from the hired men he'd had. She talked to the cows. Not constantly, not in the cooing way some people did that made the animals more nervous than calm, but occasionally, in a low voice, saying things like, "Easy now," or I know," when one of them shifted or stamped. She learned their names from him in the first 10 minutes and used them immediately, which shouldn't have struck him as significant, but somehow did. When she got to Duchess, the raw-boned roan with the troubled quarter, she spent extra time. She didn't rush the milking or shortcut it. She checked the affected side carefully, felt the tissue, watched the cow's reaction. "She's not as bad as she looks in her production numbers," Abigail said. The mastitis cleared. What's left is habit. Her system learned to hold back on that side. She needs consistent work on it, slow and regular. Another 2 months, maybe 3, she could come back close to full. "The man I bought her from would say she's done," Colton said. "The man you bought her from sold her, so his opinion has limited value." She moved to the next cow. "What's this one's name?" "She doesn't have a name. My father named the ones he considered worth naming." Abigail glanced back over her shoulder. "What did he call the criteria for naming?" Colton thought about it. "I don't know. I never asked." She turned back to the cow. "Well, I'll call her Margaret." "Margaret? She looks like a Margaret." Colton stared at the cow, which looked like no such thing and also did not object. "Fine," he said. That was the first morning. The second morning was the south pasture, which was as bad as he'd said and possibly worse. The fence line on the east side had 3 sections down completely, which meant the cattle had access to a draw that collected standing water in wet weather, water that sat stagnant and was exactly the kind of thing that caused the health problems Abigail had described finding at the Colorado operation. She walked the whole perimeter in the gray morning light, with her hands in her pockets and her boots picking up mud from the low places, and she didn't comment on the scope of the problem, which was its own kind of comment. "The fence comes first," she said when they got back to the gate. "I know that. I don't have the hands to—" "I can work fence." He looked at her. "It's not light work." "I didn't say it was." She met his eyes. "I can work fence, Mr. Hayes. I've done it before. I'm not making a point about what I'm capable of. I'm telling you what the schedule needs to be." There it was again. That quality she had of saying a thing plainly, without theater, in a way that made arguing feel wasteful. He'd known men who had that quality, the kind of men other people trusted with hard decisions. He hadn't expected to find it in a woman who'd arrived on his porch 2 days ago with 2 leather bags and a canvas roll. "Colton," he said. She blinked. "What?" "You keep saying Mr. Hayes. My father was Mr. Hayes. I'm Colton." A pause. "All right, then, the fence comes first, Colton." "I heard you the first time," he said. They started on the fence that afternoon. Over the days that followed, a shape began to emerge from what had looked like simple wreckage. Abigail worked with the kind of focus that didn't announce itself. She just did the next necessary thing, and then the next one after that, and the pile of necessary things slowly got smaller. She repaired the worst sections of the fence herself and directed Colton on the rest. She reorganized the dairy barn so the workflow moved in a direction that made physical sense, which reduced the morning milking time by almost 20 minutes. She found the vegetable garden behind the house, which had gone feral over the summer, and she didn't try to rescue all of it. She cleared the parts that could still yield something and left the rest for spring. What she couldn't do was make any of it fast. The ranch was in the kind of condition that didn't respond to urgency. It responded to patience, and patience was the one thing the calendar was in short supply of. Colton felt the pressure of it every morning when he looked at the bank letter under the coffee tin. He'd started checking it regularly, as if the date at the top might have changed. It never had. 1st of March. Significant improvement. The language of men who lent money and didn't care what the weather had been like. He told Abigail about the letter on the 4th day. He didn't plan to. It came out over supper while she was telling him what she'd found in the second breeding journal, something about the bull his father had used in '79 and what it meant for the current herd's cold tolerance, and he just said it, flat. "I've got until March." She stopped and looked at him. "How much?" He told her the number. He hadn't told another living person that number. It felt strange saying it out loud at his own table, like opening a drawer he'd been keeping shut. Abigail was quiet for a moment, doing arithmetic he couldn't see. Then, "That's tight." "Yes. Not impossible. Depends on the winter." "Everything out here depends on the winter." She looked back at the journal. "What's your current milk revenue?" "Actual numbers, not estimates." He told her. She wrote it on the back of an envelope she'd been using as a bookmark, did more arithmetic, and showed him the page. What she'd calculated was a path, narrow, with no room for error, but a path. It required the dairy income to hold, required the cattle to stay healthy through the cold months, required no major expenses he wasn't already planning for, and required that he not sell any more of the breeding stock. That last part was the one that would be hardest to defend to the bank. "They'll want to see me liquidating assets," he said. "Then show them the breeding records and explain what the assets are worth intact," she said. "A good bloodline in a territory that just had 2 devastating winters isn't a liability. It's the only thing worth having. Bankers don't read cattle journals." "Then we need to talk to the banker in a language he understands." She tapped the envelope. "These numbers work. Barely, but they work. If we show consistent milk revenue improving month over month, which it will because the schedule is already working, and if we can show the herd is healthy and increasing, he has reason to hold off." "You've dealt with bankers before?" Colton asked. She looked at him with an expression that was difficult to categorize, not bitter, not amused, somewhere in between. "My father lost his farm to a bank when I was 15, she said. After that, I paid attention to how those conversations went. He didn't press it. He filed it away. The farm, 15 years old, the paying attention, and said nothing because there was nothing useful to say about it, and she didn't seem to want anything said. "We'd need to go into town," he said instead. "Millhaven's 2 hours east." "I know. You told me in your letter." "I'll write Vickers, that's the banker, and set an appointment for December. Give us a few more weeks of numbers to show him." "That's reasonable," Abigail said. "He's not going to like it." "He doesn't have to like it. He has to find it credible." Colton looked at her across the table, the lamp between them, the journals stacked at her elbow. She had ink on 2 fingers from writing, which she hadn't noticed or didn't care about. There was something he was going to have to say eventually, something that had been sitting at the back of his thinking since the first night in this kitchen, and he said it now before he could talk himself out of it. "I want to ask you something." "All right." "Why are you still here?" She tilted her head slightly. "What do you mean?" Clara Finch looked at this place from the road and left. She wasn't wrong to. This ranch is in bad shape. The house needs work, the barn needs the roof fixed before hard winter, and the financial picture is a problem I've been honest with you about. He kept his voice even. You're capable. You know it, and I know it. You could find a better situation. Abigail was quiet for a long moment. She looked at the journal on the table, then out the dark window toward where the barn was, invisible now in the night. Do you want me to leave? She said. No, he said, quickly enough that it was honest. Then why are you asking? Because I want to know that you're here because you chose to be, not because you felt you had to honor an arrangement. She looked at him, and something in her face shifted. Not softened exactly, but opened slightly, the way a door does when the latch is lifted rather than the whole thing thrown wide. The breeding records, she said. What about them? In 15 years of working other people's land, I have never seen records like these. Your father built something here that most ranchers would have to spend a generation trying to replicate, and nobody knows it because he never had the circumstances to show it. She paused. I want to see what happens when it's given the chance it should have had. That's why I'm here. It was honest. He could tell because she didn't dress it up. She wasn't saying she stayed for him. She was saying she stayed for the cattle, for the work, for a thing she'd recognized in his father's journals that she wanted to see through. That should have been a sobering thing to hear. Somehow, it wasn't. All right, he said. All right, she said back. The first time the town got involved, it was at Lester Pruitt's feed store, and it was not kind. Colton had gone in for additional hay on a Wednesday in late November when the forecast looked grim, and Pruitt was behind the counter with two other men, Dale Wickham, who ran the equipment repair shop, and a third man Colton only vaguely knew named Foster, who'd come down from the northern range for the winter and had opinions about everything. Pruitt looked at the order Colton put on the counter and looked up. That's a bigger order than you've been placing. Herd needs feeding, Colton said. Heard you got yourself some help out there, Wickham said, from where he was leaning against the shelving. He had a particular tone, not aggressive, just the kind of lazy amusement men use when they've already decided something is funny. I hired a hand, Colton said. A woman, Foster said. That's correct. Pruitt made a sound that was technically not a laugh but functioned like one. Mail-order dairy bride is what I heard. Colton kept his face neutral, which cost him something. You heard wrong. She's staying in the house? She's an employee of the ranch, Colton said. We had an arrangement set out before she arrived. It's a business matter. Sure it is, Wickham said, in a way that made the words mean something else. Colton looked at him directly. You got something you want to say plainly, Dale. You're welcome to say it. Wickham put his hands up in the exaggerated way that means a man thinks he's being unjustly challenged. Just saying, Colton, place is already struggling. Bringing in a woman to run your dairy, to help run it, Colton said. Seems like the kind of decision a man makes when he's out of better ideas. The store was quiet. Pruitt found something to look at on his side of the counter. Colton signed the order for the hay and folded his copy and put it in his coat pocket. Then he said, My father built that ranch on better ideas than most men in this county could manage. The bloodline he put together out there is worth more than anything Callaway's running and twice what you'd get from any northern supplier. He wasn't sure where the certainty in his voice came from. 3 nights ago, he hadn't been able to say that with conviction. Somewhere in the last 2 weeks, it had taken hold. Come spring, you'll see what I'm talking about. He took his receipt and walked out. He didn't look back. He didn't need to see their faces to know what was on them. But walking back to the wagon, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Not anger, not embarrassment, something harder than both. Like the decision had already been made, and it didn't matter what Pruitt or Wickham or Foster thought about it. He drove the hay out to the ranch that afternoon and found Abigail in the barn, having apparently diagnosed something wrong with the drainage channel along the east wall, and begun addressing it with a shovel and a look of grim focus. You're going to ruin your back doing it that way, he said from the door. Then come help, she said, without stopping. He took off his coat and helped. They worked until the light went, neither of them saying much. When they finally came out, the sky was going dark at the edges, and the temperature had dropped hard in the last hour, the kind of drop that meant the forecast was right and harder weather was coming. "Pruitt's crew in town thinks I've lost my mind," Colton said, leaning on the fence at the yard's edge. Abigail stood beside him, wiping her hands on a rag. She looked out at the pasture, where the cattle were moving in their slow, reliable way toward the barn. "What did they say?" He told her, flat and without editing it. She was quiet for a moment. Then, "What did you say back?" "I told them about the bloodline, about what we're building." He paused. "I said they'd see come spring." She looked at him. In the last of the light, her expression was hard to read, but he thought there was something in it, some flicker of something she was deciding whether to show. "That's a promise you made for both of us," she said. "I know it." "You sure you want to make it?" He looked at the cattle coming in, their breath rising in small puffs in the cold air, their hooves solid on the frozen ground, their bodies thick and enduring and carrying in their blood something his father had spent years putting there. "Yes," he said. Abigail folded the rag and put it in her coat pocket. She didn't say anything more, but she stood there a moment longer than she needed to before heading inside. The cold deepened overnight. By morning there was ice on the water trough, and the sky had the white, pressed look that people who'd lived through Wyoming winters learned to read the same way sailors read a tide. They were up at 4 without discussing it. The work was the same as it had been every morning. The same cows, the same cold, the same barn. But the schedule was starting to hold, and the production numbers on Abigail's tally, she'd started keeping her own, in a small notebook she carried in her coat, were moving in the right direction. Not fast. Nothing on a ranch moves fast in November. But in the right direction, which Colton was beginning to understand was the only direction that actually mattered. The appointment with Vickers was set for the second Tuesday of December, which gave them 3 weeks to build a case out of numbers that were improving but not yet impressive. Abigail spent those 3 weeks doing what she'd been doing since she arrived. Working, recording, adjusting, but with a new layer of intentionality underneath it. Every morning's milk tally went into her notebook. Every cow's condition got noted. The fence repairs, the pasture rotation she'd started on the south field, the changes to the feeding schedule. All of it went down on paper in her small, even handwriting, building a record that could be shown to a man who needed to see things in columns to believe them. Colton watched this process with a complicated feeling he couldn't entirely name. Part of it was gratitude, which was straightforward enough. Part of it was something else, a low unease that came from watching someone work this hard on his behalf, for a ranch that might still fail despite everything, and knowing he'd brought her here for it. He said something about that one evening, clumsily, when they were at the table after supper and she was transferring numbers from her small notebook into the ledger he'd dug out from under a stack of his father's correspondence. "You don't have to do all this," he said. She looked up. "The ledger?" All of it, the extra work. You've gone past what the arrangement called for." Abigail looked at him for a moment with the expression she used when she thought he was saying something that didn't quite make sense. "The arrangement called for me to help run the ranch," she said. "This is running the ranch. The numbers work, the presentation to Vickers, Colton." She said his name in the way she'd been saying it for 2 weeks now. Not warmly exactly, but easily, without the slight formality she'd used at the start. "If the bank forecloses in March, none of the rest of it matters. The dairy schedule, the breeding herd, your father's records, all of it goes with the property." She turned back to the ledger. "So yes, I'm going to spend time on the numbers." He was quiet. "What I need from you," she continued, writing while she talked, "is to know what Vickers responded to when you've dealt with him before. Is he a man who wants to hear about long-term value, or does he want short-term payment?" "He's a bank man," Colton said. "He wants his money." "That's not what I asked." Colton thought about the 2 conversations he'd had with Edward Vickers, both of which had gone badly in different ways. Vickers was a compact, precise man in his 50s who wore a good coat and spoke in a manner that was never rude, but always made you aware of the distance between his chair and yours. "He talks about collateral a lot," Colton said. "Every time I've dealt with him, he keeps coming back to what the property's worth against what I owe." "Then we lead with asset value," Abigail said. "Not income projections. What is the herd worth on the open market right now, today, at current prices? The way I've been running it? Less than what I owe. The way the bloodline is documented and the herd is structured? She lifted her pen. Different number, significantly different. I've been doing some research on cattle prices coming out of this region. The Durham cross stock your father built. If we put those records in front of a buyer who knew what he was looking at, we're talking about a premium price per head. That makes the herd a stronger asset than Vickers currently believes it is. Colton stared at her. You've been pricing the cattle. I've been understanding what they're actually worth, she said, which is not the same thing as selling them. This was the quality in her that he kept bumping up against. The way she could hold two things at once that other people treated as opposites. The cattle were not for sale, and knowing their value was essential to saving the ranch. Both true, neither canceling the other out. He's still going to push for liquidation, Colton said. Probably. That's when you tell him that liquidating the breeding stock is the one move that guarantees the ranch fails permanently. Right now it's struggling. A struggling operation can recover. A gutted one can't. She closed the ledger. Give him the choice between a difficult debtor who has a real plan and a piece of land he'd have to sell in bad market conditions for less than the note. Bankers don't actually want foreclosed property. They want to look like they made a good loan. Colton said nothing for a moment. Then, where did you learn to think like this? I told you, my father lost his farm. You said you paid attention to how those conversations went. That's not the same as learning how to have them. Something crossed her face, briefly, there and gone. I was 15, and there was nothing I could do, she said. I swore after that I'd learned to do what I couldn't do then. She stood and took the ledger to the shelf where they'd been keeping the financial records, neatly separate from the breeding journals. Go over what I've written. Correct anything I've gotten wrong about the operation costs. We'll go over the presentation together before we leave Tuesday. She said goodnight and went to her room. Colton sat at the table for a long while after, the lamp burning down and the house quiet around him, thinking about a 15-year-old girl who watched her family lose everything and decided to learn how to fight a bank. They drove to Millhaven on a Tuesday that was as cold as the inside of a stone well. The road was frozen hard and the horses moved well on it, their breath making regular clouds in the gray air. Abigail sat beside him on the wagon seat with the ledger and a flat case on her lap, dressed in her best coat, which was better than her everyday one but still spoke of practical rather than fine. He'd put on his father's wool coat, which still fit well enough and was the most presentable thing he owned. They made a pair, the two of them. Not ragged exactly, but clearly not people who had extra to spend on appearances. Let me do most of the talking, Colton said, about a mile out from town. Of course, Abigail said. He glanced at her. But if he says something that's factually wrong about the herd, I'll correct it. Politely. I'm always polite, she said, in a tone that didn't commit to anything. Millhaven was a real town, meaning it had 2 hotels, a courthouse, and a bank building with actual brick on the front half. The Millhaven Territorial Bank occupied the ground floor of that building and had the interior temperature of a place that heated itself primarily with other people's money. Edward Vickers met them in a small office off the main hall. He was exactly as Colton had described, compact, precise, a good coat worn without flourish. He shook Colton's hand with the particular grip of a man who has measured every person he's ever met and filed them somewhere. He looked at Abigail with an expression that didn't change but processed. This is Miss Rowan, Colton said. She manages the dairy operations. Miss Rowan, Vickers said, with exactly the courtesy of a man who does not consider the introduction particularly relevant. They sat. Vickers folded his hands on the desk. Mr. Hayes, he said, I'll be straightforward with you, because I think that serves both of us better than dancing around the situation. The outstanding balance on the Hayes property note is past the point where I can extend further patience based on good intention alone. I need to see material improvement, and I need to see it on paper. That's why we're here, Colton said. He nodded to Abigail. She opened the case and placed the ledger on the desk, already open to the first relevant page. She tabbed it with small strips of paper so it fell open exactly where needed. She slid it across toward Vickers without a word. Vickers looked at it. The silence in the room had a quality to it, the kind of silence where something is being assessed. Daily milk production tallies, Abigail said, for the past 3 weeks, against the 3 weeks prior to my arrival. The improvement is 18% on current output, with projected trajectory based on continued schedule normalization. She spoke the way she did everything, straight, without decoration. Below that, the herd condition record. I've assessed each animal individually. The column on the right is my evaluation of each cow's current market value, cross-referenced with current territorial pricing. Vickers looked at the numbers. He turned a page. Who compiled this? I did, Abigail said. He glanced up, then back to the page. You have a background in accounting? I have a background in not losing things I care about, she said. The arithmetic is straightforward. Colton kept his face still. Vickers turned another page. He stopped on the section where Abigail had laid out the breeding record summary. Not the journals themselves, which would have meant nothing to a banker, but a translated version. Bloodline origin, documented cold weather performance, estimated premium value per head against standard regional stock. These figures, Vickers said, the per head valuation on the breeding stock. This is significantly higher than what your herd was assessed at last spring. The spring assessment was done by a buyer looking to purchase at wholesale, Abigail said. It wasn't a fair market valuation. The animal quality and bloodline documentation weren't taken into account. And you believe they should be? I believe any lender holding a note against this property should understand what the actual collateral is worth, she said. The breeding herd, properly documented, represents an asset value that changes the arithmetic on this loan considerably. Vickers looked at Colton. You're not proposing to sell these animals. No, Colton said. Then their value to me as collateral is theoretical. Their value to you as collateral is real, Abigail said, as long as they're alive and healthy and producing calves, which they will be if the operation is allowed to function through the spring, rather than being forced into a liquidation that destroys the core asset. She paused. Mr. Vickers, what does the bank gain from foreclosing in March? You take a property in poor condition, in a territory coming off 2 hard winters, in a market where land is moving slowly. You sell it for less than the note and absorb the loss, or you carry it until conditions improve and pay for the maintenance in the meantime. She was not aggressive. She was simply laying out facts the way she laid out everything. What we're proposing is that you give this operation until June, 6 months. If the spring calving goes as the records indicate it should, the revenue and asset picture looks entirely different. If it doesn't, she glanced at Colton briefly, then you foreclose on a herd that has fresh calves on the ground, which is significantly more valuable than what you'd take in March. The office was quiet. Outside, the street sounds of Millhaven, wagon wheels, voices, a door, filtered in and felt very far away. Vickers tapped the ledger with one finger. He was thinking. You could see the machinery of it in the slight stillness of his face. The spring calving, he said. What's your projected number? Abigail answered without hesitating. 14 viable calves, minimum from the current breeding herd, based on the documented conception rates in the bloodline records. At current calf prices for quality stock in this territory, that's a substantial addition to the asset column. If the winter cooperates, Vickers said. If the winter cooperates, she agreed, that's a risk we're all taking. Another silence. Vickers closed the ledger slowly, which was either a bad sign or a thinking sign, and Colton couldn't tell which. He sat back slightly in his chair and looked at Colton directly, the way he had not been doing since Abigail started talking. Mr. Hayes, he said, this is not a commitment, but I'm willing to hold the note at its current terms through the 1st of April rather than March, contingent on monthly written reports of production figures and herd status. If I see the trajectory reflected in these numbers continuing, we discuss further. If I don't, he paused. The foreclosure proceeds as outlined in the original agreement. 1 month. 1 additional month. It wasn't what they'd asked for. It wasn't close to June. Colton felt the tight thing in his chest that had been there since he'd gotten the letter in October. And it didn't loosen, but it shifted. Not gone, just changed shape slightly. He looked at Abigail. She was looking at Vickers with an expression that was controlled but not empty, and he could see just barely the set of her jaw. "April 1st, she said. "We'll have a full spring calving report ready by the last week of March." "See that you do," Vickers said. He stood and extended his hand across the desk to Colton. The meeting concluded. He nodded to Abigail without extending a hand, which was not unusual for the time, but which sat in the room like a small insult no one acknowledged. They walked out of the bank into the cold street and stood by the wagon without speaking for a moment. "1 month," Colton said. "1 month is enough if the winter isn't catastrophic," Abigail said. She was putting the ledger case under the wagon seat, her back to him. "That's a significant if." "Yes." She straightened and looked at the sky, which had the white, heavy look it had been wearing for a week now. "He would have held it March if I hadn't been there. That's something. You did most of the talking." "You said you'd talk and I'd correct factual errors," she said. He had a factual error about the asset value. "For 20 straight minutes." The edge of something crossed her face, not quite a smile, not quite exasperation. "I'm always polite," she said, the same way she'd said it on the road in. Despite everything, despite the cold and the single-month extension and the long drive back and the winter pressing down from all sides, Colton almost laughed. He turned it into something that was only a compressed expression and climbed up to the wagon seat. "Come on," he said. "It's going to snow before we get home." He was right. It started about 4 miles out of Millhaven, light at first and then not light, the flakes coming sideways in a wind that had found its pace. By the time they turned up the lane to the ranch, the world had gone white at the edges and the barn was a warm shape against the dark. They put the horses up together, working quickly, and then ran across the yard to the house with the snow coming hard behind them. Inside, the stove needed stoking, and Colton did it while Abigail shook the snow off her coat at the door and hung it on the peg. "April," he said to the stove, feeding it another piece of wood. "April," she said from behind him, "we need a good winter." "We need to survive whatever winter we get," she said, "which isn't the same thing." He closed the stove and stood up and turned around. She was at the table, her hair coming loose from the pins where the wind had worked at it on the drive, her face still cold pink from outside. She was looking at the notebook she'd pulled from her coat pocket, already thinking ahead to the monthly report Vickers had asked for, already calculating what the next 6 weeks had to produce. He stood there for a moment, just looking at her in the way that had become a habit he hadn't decided to form, a thing that happened before he caught himself and found something else to look at. She looked up from the notebook. "What?" "Nothing," he said. She held his gaze for a moment longer than necessary, then looked back down. "I need to check the cattle before we eat. The temperature's dropping." "I'll come with you." "You don't have to." "I know," he said. They went back out into the snow. The cattle were restless with the change in weather, moving and shifting in the barn in the way animals do when they feel something coming that humans haven't noticed yet. Colton went down the left side and Abigail went down the right, checking, speaking quietly, making sure every animal had feed and water and was settled as much as they could be settled. At the far end of the barn, Abigail stopped at Duchess. The roan cow had been improving steadily for 3 weeks, the affected quarter responding slowly to consistent work. She wasn't back to full production and might never be entirely, but she was producing more than she had been, and her body condition had improved enough that she'd stopped looking like a bad argument for giving up. Abigail put her hand on the cow's neck and stood there for a moment, not doing anything in particular, just standing there in the barn with the snow coming down outside and the cattle breathing around her and the smell of hay and warm animal filling the space. "She's going to make it through winter," Abigail said. Not to Colton specifically, more like a statement to the barn in general. "She is," Colton said from the other side of the barn. Outside, the snow was building against the walls, and the wind had found the gap at the barn door's base and was pushing cold air under it in a thin, persistent stream. It was going to be a hard night. Colton walked back down the center of the barn toward the door, checking the latch, making sure the side panels were secure. It would not be the last hard night. December was just beginning, and January and February were ahead, and Wyoming winters did not apologize for what they were. He thought about April, about the calves that existed right now as a promise inside the breeding herd, that his father had spent years engineering, that Abigail had found in 3 notebooks in a wooden crate and understood immediately. He thought about what it would take to protect them through the months between now and then, and how much of that depended on things that were not in his control, and how little that feeling had changed from the day he'd posted the advertisement. But here was what was different, standing in his father's barn on a December night with the snow building and April still 4 months away. He was not doing it alone. That fact sat in his chest quietly and didn't leave, even when he blew out the barn lamp and they walked back across the yard to the house in the dark, the snow covering their footprints behind them almost as fast as they made them. January came in like something that had been waiting. The snow that had started in December never fully stopped. It eased off for days at a time, enough to work, enough to breathe, and then came back harder than before. By the second week of January, the drifts along the north fence had climbed past the second rail, and the temperature at night was dropping to places on the thermometer that Colton had seen before but never gotten comfortable with. They had settled into a rhythm by then, the two of them, the kind that develops between people who work the same hours in the same spaces and have stopped needing to narrate every decision. Abigail was up before 4. Colton was already at the stove. Coffee happened without discussion. The barn happened after that, and then the rest of the day arranged itself around what the cattle needed and what the weather allowed. It wasn't without friction. They disagreed about the feeding rotation in January, Abigail wanting to increase the grain ration for the pregnant cows earlier than Colton thought the supply justified, and they had a conversation about it at the kitchen table that went on longer than either of them probably wanted and ended without full resolution, both of them backing off to think. She turned out to be right about the timing. He told her so 3 days later without making a production of it, just saying it plainly while they were in the barn. She nodded and said nothing further, which was exactly the right response, and he appreciated it. What he didn't tell her was that he'd lain awake the night of that argument going over the feed numbers until he was certain she was right, and then lying there anyway because the argument hadn't been only about grain rations. It had been about control, about what it meant to share decisions on land that had always been his alone to get wrong, and about the particular difficulty of trusting someone who was better informed than you were on the thing you'd spent your life doing. He didn't say any of that. He said she was right about the timing. She said thank you. They fed the cows. That was January. The blizzard arrived on the 4th of February without the courtesy of a gradual warning. There had been signs, the kind you learn to read after enough winters in that country. The sky going a particular flat white that was different from regular cloud cover, the cattle becoming agitated in the way they did when pressure changed, the air getting a stillness before the wind that felt like something holding its breath. Colton woke at 2 in the morning and knew before he looked out the window. He dressed in the dark and came out to find Abigail already in the kitchen, already in her coat, already pulling on her second pair of socks with the focused economy of someone who'd been awake longer than him. "You heard it too," he said. "Belt it," she said. "The air pressure changed around midnight. I've been awake since then." He looked at her. "You should have woken me." "You needed the sleep more than I did." She stood. "We need to get the cattle into the barn before it hits full. The side shelter on the north." "I know. The north side won't hold in a serious blow." "Then we move them now." She was already at the door. "All of them. Tight quarters is better than what's coming." He didn't argue. He pulled on his coat and gloves and followed her out. What was coming hit them before they'd gotten half the cattle moved. The wind came first, which is how blizzards announce themselves on the Wyoming plains. Not with snow, but with wind. A wall of it that arrives out of the northwest and hits you like something physical, like the weather has decided to become a solid object. It took Colton's hat, and he lost 30 seconds chasing it, which was 30 seconds he thought about for the rest of the night as time he'd spent on the wrong thing. The snow came with the wind, not falling, but driving sideways. And in 20 minutes, the yard was a different place. Familiar shapes gone soft and unreliable. The lamp they'd hung at the barn door barely visible from 30 feet. They worked by feel and memory as much as sight. Colton took the north pasture animals, moving them in by ones and twos, pushing them into the barn through the side door that Abigail held open from inside. The cattle didn't want to move in the dark and the noise and kept turning their backs to the wind. which is the instinct that saves cattle in the open and kills them when you need them moving. He was pushing against 600 pounds of animal stubbornness in a wind that wanted to push back, using his body and his voice and the stick he carried, and his hands went numb inside the gloves in the first 15 minutes. He lost count of trips. Inside the barn, Abigail was managing the incoming animals, keeping them from piling up at the door, distributing them into the space with the controlled efficiency of someone who'd thought through the geometry of it in advance. She'd already moved the hay to the walls to create more floor space. She'd already separated the most heavily pregnant cows to the far end where they'd have the least stress. She was doing 3 things at once and doing none of them wrong, but her face when he came in with a group and she looked up at him had an edge to it that he recognized. The look of a person running a calculation and not liking the result. "The Delaney spread," she said, when there was a moment's pause. "What about it?" 3 of their cattle got through the south fence when I was moving ours. They're in with the herd now. The Delaney spread sat adjacent on the south side, and the fence between them had been repaired but not reinforced before the ground froze too hard for proper post setting. "How many of ours are still out?" 4. 2 are the ones due earliest. She handed him the rope she'd been using. "I need to get them." "You stay," he said immediately. "I know where they shelter. You've got 6 in the north corner that need settling or they'll injure each other." "Abigail." She stopped. "Stay in the barn," he said. "I'll find them." She held his eyes for one moment, something in her expression that wasn't quite argument and wasn't quite agreement, and then nodded. "East side of the pasture, near the old water trough. They always drift that direction when they're scared." He went back out. The walk to the east pasture took 3 times what it should have because the wind was at its worst now, and the snow had reduced visibility to a distance you could measure in steps rather than yards. He counted fence posts by touch when he couldn't see them, moving along the line. And he was thinking about his father in a way he hadn't allowed himself to think about him in a long time. Not the complicated feelings, just the practical ones. The things Gerald Hayes had done in situations like this. How he had moved through bad weather with a kind of deliberate calm that Colton had always interpreted as his father not being afraid, and now understood was his father being afraid, and doing the work anyway. He found them at the old trough exactly where she'd said, 2 heavily pregnant cows pressed against each other, backs to the storm, doing the instinctive thing. He got them moving with effort and patience and brought them in the long way, around the east side, because the direct path through the yard had drifted deep enough in 20 minutes that it was faster to go around. When he came through the barn door with the last 2, Abigail looked at them, then at him, and the thing that crossed her face was not relief exactly, but something that lived next to it. "The other 2?" she said. "Got them 20 minutes ago. They're in the front section." She closed her eyes for 1 second, just one. Then she opened them and went back to checking the cattle. They didn't stop until dawn, and dawn was not a dramatic thing, and just a slightly lighter shade of dark that told you the clock was moving even if nothing else felt like it was. The wind continued. The snow continued. They ate standing up, bread and cold meat that Abigail had thought to bring out from the house in her coat pocket hours before. And the barn was crowded and warm with animal heat and smelled powerfully of everything barns smell of in close quarters. Colton sat on a hay bale with his back against the wall and looked at his hands, which had stopped being numb and moved into the aching phase that meant circulation was returning. His left thumb had a cut on it from somewhere, the fence wire probably, that he hadn't felt until now. Abigail sat down on the bale beside him, not at the other end. Beside him, close enough that their shoulders almost touched, because the barn was crowded and the hay bale wasn't large and she was tired, which were reasons enough. "How bad is it going to get?" she said. "I've seen worse," Colton said. "Not often. The feed." "I know." He did know. The hay supply, which he'd built up carefully through December with her input on quantities, was going to be strained if this ran more than 3 days. They'd planned for a hard winter. They had not planned for all of it arriving at once. "If it runs past the 5th, she said, meaning the 5th day, "we need to think about the grain store." "The grain store is for the pregnant cows." "I know what it's for. I'm telling you, we may have to make decisions about it." He looked at her. In the half-light of the barn, she looked tired in a way she didn't usually let show. The kind of tired that gets past the defenses when it's 2 in the morning and you've been working for 4 hours in a blizzard. Her hair was coming down entirely from whatever it had been pinned in, and there was a scrape along her jaw from something, the fence or a branch driven by wind that she either hadn't noticed or hadn't commented on. "You're bleeding," he said. He nodded toward her jaw. She touched it, looked at her fingers. "It's nothing. It's something. It's small." She lowered her hand. "I'll deal with it inside." "We're not going inside for a while." She looked at him. He pulled off his right glove and reached into his coat pocket where he had, by long habit, a folded piece of cloth for exactly the kind of small damage that ranching produced constantly. He held it out. She took it and pressed it to the scrape without comment, and they sat there side by side on the hay bale with the cattle moving around them and the wind working at the barn walls in long, sustained pushes that sounded like a physical argument the storm was having with the structure. "My father built this barn in 1863, Colton said. He didn't know why he said it. He was tired, and the middle of a blizzard had a way of making the inside of your head quieter than usual, cutting out the parts that told you what was and wasn't appropriate to say. "What kind of man was he?" Abigail asked. She said it the way someone asks when they've been wanting to ask for a while. Colton thought about it honestly, which was harder than it should have been. "He was better at this than I am," he said. "Better at the land, better with the animals, better at getting people to work for him, though I've never known if that was because he paid better or talked better or just made them feel like the work was worth doing." He paused. "He wasn't an easy man to be a son to." "No?" "He had high expectations and not many words about them. You were supposed to figure out what he wanted by watching him do it." He looked at the far end of the barn where the pregnant cows were settled, Duchess among them. "I was better at the watching than the doing, I think. For a long time." Abigail was quiet for a moment. "He kept those journals for 30 years, she said. "Every breeding decision, every winter, every cow. That's not a man who didn't care about leaving something behind." "He cared. He wasn't good at saying so." "Maybe the journals were how he said so." Colton looked at her. "He didn't keep those records for himself," she said. "A man who only wants to know something for himself keeps it in his head. He wrote it all down because he intended someone to read it, to use it." She pressed the cloth gently against her jaw and then lowered it. "He intended you to read it." Colton said nothing. The things she'd said sat in the room with the cattle and the wind and the smell of hay, and he let it sit there without trying to do anything with it. After a while, she spoke again. "The Callaway spread," she said. "What about it?" "I heard in town before the storm that they've been having trouble with the herd. Something about a disease moving through their stock." Colton sat up slightly. "Callaway hasn't said anything to me." "He wouldn't. Your competition." She said it flatly, without judgment about what it implied. "But the 3 cows that came through the south fence tonight, they're Delaney stock, not Callaway. If Delaney's fence failed in this storm, there may be contamination risk between herds." He saw immediately what she was thinking. "We need to keep the Delaney cattle separate from ours until we can check them over. In the morning, when there's light." She stood, the tiredness still in her face, but the working mind clearly back at the surface. "I'll section off the east corner for them now while I'm thinking about it. It's 3 in the morning. I know what time it is." She was already moving toward the stored fence panels at the side wall. "Help me with the corner posts." He followed her without arguing. That was how they spent the 3rd hour of the blizzard, erecting a temporary partition in the barn by lamplight, sorting cattle in a crowded space in conditions that made everything take 3 times as long. Neither of them complaining about the hour or the cold or the smell or the fact that both of them were running on exhaustion and bread and whatever stubborn thing lives in people who have decided something matters. Around 4:30, the wind dropped slightly. Not gone, but eased, the way a storm sometimes pauses to regroup. In that brief easing, Colton stepped outside to check the barn roof along the north side, where a section had been worrying him since the first wave hit. The damage was real, but not catastrophic. 2 boards had been pushed loose at the eave, and the gap was letting snow sift in along the north wall. In the dark, in wind that was still considerable, it was not a repair he could make safely alone. He went back inside. "North eave," he said to Abigail. 2 boards. She looked at the ceiling, reading the situation. "If If we don't get to it before the next wave, the wet will spread to the framing. I know. I can hold the boards if you can drive the nails. He looked at her. It means going up there in this. I've worked worse, she said, in the tone she used for facts that didn't require discussion. They went up together, Colton on the ladder with the hammer and nails, Abigail on the roof beside him holding the boards against the frame with both hands and her body weight, the wind finding every gap in their clothing and making the position miserable in a way that was also somehow clarifying. You find out what you're made of on a rooftop at 5 in the morning in a blizzard, not in any dramatic sense, just in the plain sense of whether you let go or you hold. She held. The repair took 20 minutes and wasn't pretty and would need proper fixing when the weather broke, but it held against the next wave of the storm, which came back at 6 and was harder than the first. They rode it out in the barn. By midday on the second day, the cattle from the Delaney spread had been assessed, and one showed signs that concerned Abigail enough that she isolated it further, in the small separate stall at the barn's east end, away from both the main herd and the other Delaney animals. She did it quietly and didn't speculate out loud about what she thought she was seeing, because speculating out loud about cattle disease in the middle of a blizzard with no veterinarian within reach was not useful, and Abigail Rowan was almost never not useful. But Colton saw the way she watched that animal, and he understood. The storm ran 3 days and then a partial fourth, the way Wyoming blizzards sometimes did, the last day being less a storm than its debris. Wind still high, visibility still poor. The landscape changed enough that familiar things looked wrong. Fences buried. The south pasture become an undifferentiated white slope. When it finally broke on the morning of the 4th day, real light came through the barn door for the first time since February 4th, and it hit the cattle and the hay dust and the partition they'd built and the tired, cold-scraped faces of the 2 people who'd spent 4 days not sleeping enough in there, and it made everything it touched look like the thing it was, worn and kept and still standing. Colton stood at the barn door and looked out at the ranch. The damage was real. A section of the south fence had gone down completely. The outbuilding they used for equipment storage had a section of roof collapsed under the snow weight. Drifts against the house were past the first window on the north side, but the barn stood. The cattle were standing. The pregnant cows at the far end were alert and healthy, and carrying their calves into a February that had done its worst and found them still in it. Abigail came to stand beside him. She looked at the same wreckage he was looking at, the same white-covered evidence of what 4 days of serious weather could do to a frontier operation. 12 confirmed pregnant, she said. All of them solid. The one from Delaney I isolated. She's not our problem, and she didn't get close enough to be one. That's good news. That's very good news. She paused. The south fence will take a week to fix properly. I know. The equipment shed roof. I know, he said. He said it without edge. He was looking at the pasture, the white expanse of it, the cattle trails visible in the snow where they'd broken through the drifts to get to the water. His land. His father's land. 45 days to April. We made it through, he said. Not triumphant, just factual, the way the really important things often come out. Abigail said nothing for a moment. She was looking out too, and she had the same expression she'd had the first day she arrived, the attentive, note-taking look of someone reading a place and finding it worth reading. We did, she said. The morning sun was sharp on the snow, the kind of brightness that almost hurt after days of gray. Colton looked at it for a moment, then looked at the work that was waiting. There was a great deal of it. There always was. He turned back into the barn to start on the first part of it. Behind him, he heard her do the same. The south fence took 9 days to fix properly, not 1 week, because the ground under the snow turned out to be worse than it looked, and 2 of the corner posts had heaved in the freeze and needed resetting from scratch. Colton did most of the heavy post work and Abigail ran the wire, and they didn't talk much while they worked because the cold made talking expensive, and there wasn't anything to say that the work wasn't already sane. February finished itself out in the grudging way of a month that knows it has overstayed. There were 2 more storms, neither of them serious by the standard the blizzard had set, and the cattle moved through them without incident, which Colton took as evidence of something but tried not to say out loud, because saying things out loud about cattle surviving winter before winter was actually over was the kind of confidence that frontier life had a way of punishing. The first calf came on the 14th of February. Abigail was there for it. She'd been checking the pregnant cows every 3 hours through the nights of the second week, sleeping in pieces, which Colton had argued about and lost. The calf was from a young cow they'd both been watching closely. The first pregnancy, always the uncertain one, and it came without serious complication in the early morning while the sky outside was still full dark and cold, and the barn was warm and close and smelled of hay and effort. Colton came in from the house at 4 to find Abigail crouched in the stall with the newborn calf, helping it find its feet, her hands careful and sure. She looked up at him when he came in. "She did it herself mostly," Abigail said. "I just made sure nobody panicked." The calf was small and dark, and improbably determined about standing up, which it kept attempting and kept failing at, and the mother was doing the thing mothers do: the cleaning, the nudging, the specific low sound that seems to be directed only at that one animal. Colton leaned on the stall rail and watched. "That's one," he said. 13 more to go," Abigail said. She stood and brushed her hands on her trousers. Her eyes were tired in the way they'd been for 2 weeks, and there was hay in her hair, and she looked at the calf with an expression that was too complicated to name, but that Colton understood because he felt something similar. Not happiness exactly, more like the feeling of a long-held breath beginning to release. The calves came over the following 3 weeks in ones and twos, spaced by nature's indifference to human scheduling. Not all of them easy. The 7th was a difficult birth that took 4 hours, and both of them working through most of it. And the calf was small and slow to nurse, and spent his first 2 days being the subject of Abigail's focused, slightly anxious attention in a way that she didn't comment on, but that Colton noticed. He survived. She called him February, which Colton thought was a terrible name for a bull calf, and said so. And she said she didn't care what he thought, and that was the end of that. By the 3rd week of March, 13 calves were on the ground and healthy. The 14th arrived on the 22nd, Duchess's calf, which came easily and which was, from the first hour, the largest and most confident animal in the barn, standing up and looking around with an expression of complete self-assurance that was either a good sign or a warning about its future personality. Abigail stood looking at Duchess and the calf for a long time that morning. "Say it," Colton said. She glanced at him. "Say what?" "Whatever you're thinking. You have the look you get when you're thinking something you're deciding whether to say." She looked back at the calf. "Your father's bull line," she said. "The Montana Cross. This calf is the best expression of it I've seen in the herd. If he develops the way the bloodline suggests he should—" She stopped. "Go on." "He could be the foundation sire for everything that comes next." She said it simply, like a fact, like something she'd already accepted as true and was just now letting out into the open air. Your father worked toward this. He just didn't live to see it. Colton looked at the calf, which was already investigating the edges of the stall with the curiosity of an animal that intends to be large and wants to understand its world early. "What do you want to name him?" he asked. She shook her head. "That one's yours to name." He thought for a moment. "Gerald," he said. Abigail looked at him. Something in her face was quiet and careful. "That's right," she said. Just that. They drove to Millhaven on the 28th of March, 3 days ahead of Vickers' deadline, with the ledger and a new set of figures that were, by any honest accounting, not the figures of a failing operation. 14 calves. Dairy production up 31% from November. Herd body condition at its best recorded point in 4 years. Feed costs managed within the numbers Abigail had laid out in December. The south fence repaired. The equipment shed roof rebuilt with lumber they'd been able to afford because they had not, despite every pressure and every voice telling them otherwise, sold the breeding stock. Vickers received them in the same office, in the same good coat, with the same precise manner. He read through what they put in front of him with the thoroughness of a man who'd been doing this long enough to know when numbers were dressed up and when they were real. He took his time. They let him. When he closed the ledger, he looked at Abigail first, then Colton. 14 calves, he said. 14, Colton said. All surviving. All surviving. Vickers tapped the cover of the ledger once. Then he leaned back in his chair slightly. A small movement, but Colton had been watching him carefully enough to read it. The herd valuation you've laid out here, with the calf additions and the bloodline documentation. It's a conservative estimate, Abigail said. We've had 2 inquiries about purchasing breeding stock in the past 3 weeks. We turned both of them down, but the interest confirms the market value. Vickers looked at her. You've had buyers approaching you. Word travels in this territory, she said. Ranchers talk. When a herd survives a winter like this one in better condition than when it went in, people notice. It was true. Colton hadn't entirely anticipated how quickly it would travel, but the blizzard had been the kind of event that the territory would measure other winters against for years, and the losses among neighboring operations had been severe. The Delaney spread had lost 1/3 of its cattle. 2 smaller ranches north of Harlan Creek had lost more than that. Callaway, who'd had the disease moving through his herd before the storm, had come out of February in a condition that the county was discussing in the careful, quiet way people discuss a neighbor's serious trouble. And the Hayes Ranch had come out with 14 calves and a dairy production number that was the best it had been in years. People noticed, people talked, and some of those people, it turned out, had money and wanted cattle, and had found their way down the lane to the Hayes property to make inquiries that Abigail had recorded carefully in her notebook and then politely declined. Vickers was quiet for a long moment. I'm going to restructure the note, he said. Colton heard it, but made himself wait before responding, because he'd been in enough situations where he'd heard something he wanted to hear and found out later he'd heard it wrong. On what terms? He said. Extended repayment period. Lower monthly obligation against the principal. The current asset picture justifies it. Vickers looked at him directly. You've turned this around, Mr. Hayes. I'll acknowledge that plainly. We've turned it around, Colton said. He said it without particular emphasis, just correcting the pronoun. Vickers glanced at Abigail. Yes, he said. I expect that's accurate. It was not a warm moment. Vickers was not a warm man, but it was an honest one, and Colton had learned in the last 4 months to value honesty in a way that had been theoretical before, to understand that it was worth more than warmth in most of the situations that actually mattered. They left Millhaven an hour later with a signed agreement that restructured the debt on terms that were, if not comfortable, survivable, more than survivable, if spring continued the way it had begun. The drive back was quieter than the December drive, which had been quiet in the tense way, the way of people carrying a heavy thing and not sure it won't drop. This quiet was different. Colton drove and Abigail sat beside him with her hands folded in her lap, not reading or writing for once, just watching the land go past. The territory looked different in late March. The snow was pulling back from the south-facing slopes. The creek was running loud and clear, snowmelt filling it up to the edge of its banks. The grass underneath where the drifts had been was the pale, pressed flat yellow of winter grass waiting. You should buy the Delaney parcel, Abigail said, about 6 miles from home. He looked at her. The Delaney parcel isn't for sale. It will be, she said. Give it 6 weeks. He lost too many animals. He's already talking to people about his options. I heard it in town. You hear a lot in town. I pay attention in town, she said, the same distinction she'd made before. The parcel shares your south fence line. If you could acquire it, even a portion of it, the pasture rotation I want to do in the fall requires more acreage than you currently have. The herd is going to outgrow this spread within 2 years if the calves develop the way they should. He drove and thought about it. The idea was not small. The idea was, in fact, the kind of idea that would have seemed like lunacy 4 months ago when he was 3 weeks from losing what he had. One thing at a time, he said. I know, she said. I'm just telling you now, so it's in the thinking. It's in the thinking, he said. She nodded and went back to watching the land. Spring broke fully in April, the way it does in Wyoming when it finally commits. Not gradually, but all at once, like a door opening. The grass came back green and fast in the bottom pastures, and the calves, who had been barn animals for their entire existence, went out into it for the first time and had the experience that calves always have of discovering that the world is larger and more interesting than the structure they were born in. Gerald, the Duchess calf, The 14th, the big dark one with the self-assurance, turned out to be everything Abigail's reading of the bloodline had suggested he might be. By April, he was the largest animal in the calf group by a margin that other ranchers who came to look at the herd commented on immediately. There was something in the way he moved, even young, that was different from ordinary cattle, a quality of structure, of depth through the chest and length through the back, that Gerald Hayes Sr. had been trying to build for 30 years and had, in this animal, finally arrived at. Abigail was right that word traveled. By May, there were buyers coming to the ranch on a regular enough basis that Colton had to set aside 2 afternoons a week for showing the herd, which was a thing that would have seemed like fiction in November. He didn't sell Gerald. He didn't sell the core breeding cows. He sold 3 of the 14 calves, the ones the bloodline records identified as the least essential to the forward breeding plan. And the price he got for them was higher than anything a Hayes Ranch animal had sold for in his memory. And it was Abigail who negotiated the price, standing in the yard in her everyday coat with a buyer from the Northern Territory who'd driven 2 days to get there, and she didn't waver on the number she'd decided on. The buyer paid it. After he left, Colton stood at the fence and looked at the pasture for a long moment. "You could have gone higher," he said. "No," Abigail said. "That was the right price, high enough to establish the value. Not so high that he feels he overpaid and tells people so." She leaned on the fence beside him. "You want buyers to come back? You want them to tell other buyers the price was fair. The reputation matters more than the extra $10. He looked at her. She was looking at the pasture, the calves in the grass, the dairy cows moving in their reliable morning way toward the water. There was something he needed to say. He'd been carrying it for a while, in the way you carry something you know needs to be put down, but haven't found the right moment for, or more honestly, have found plenty of moments and talked yourself out of each of them for one reason or another. "Abigail," he said. "The arrangement we made in November." She looked at him then, the full direct look she'd been giving him since the first day. "What about it?" "It was a business arrangement," he said. "I want to ask if you'd consider changing it." The pasture was quiet. A calf made a sound somewhere in the grass, and its mother answered. "To what?" she said. She said it without coyness or performance, which was exactly how she said everything, and which he had come to understand was not distance, but its opposite, a kind of honesty that didn't dress things up. "Something that isn't a business arrangement," he said. He looked at her. "I'm not good at this. I want to be honest about that. I'm not a man who knows how to—" He stopped. "I've been watching you work this ranch for 5 months. I know what you are. I know what you've done here. And I know that somewhere in the middle of all of it, I stopped thinking about the ranch when I looked at you and started thinking about you." She was quiet. "That probably came out wrong," he said. "No," she said. "It came out like you." He wasn't entirely sure what that meant, but it didn't feel like a bad thing. "I'm not going to leave," she said after a moment. "That's not what I'm deciding. I want to be here. I want to see what happens with Gerald and the spring calving next year and the Delaney parcel if it comes available." She paused. "But I need you to understand something." "Tell me." "I've spent 10 years working other people's land," she said, "doing good work on it and walking away when the arrangement ended or when I was no longer needed or when the situation changed. I'm not interested in doing that again." She looked at him steadily. "If we change the arrangement, I need it to mean something permanent, not a convenience, not something that gets reconsidered when things get difficult." "I'm not asking for a convenience," he said. "I know you're not. I'm telling you what I'm asking for." "Then I'm asking for the same thing," Colton said. "Permanent. Whatever that looks like when 2 people decide to build something together instead of separately." The pasture sat around them, green and enormous, the grass moving slightly in the April wind. The cattle were doing what they did, which was be cattle, indifferent to human arrangements and human feelings, present and heavy and alive in the way that cattle are alive, set completely without complication. "All right," Abigail said. "All right," he said. They stood at the fence a moment longer, which maybe sounds like nothing but was. In the way of people who don't use words carelessly, everything. They married in June, in the front room of the house, with the county judge who came through Harlan Creek on his circuit and two witnesses who were the closest thing to friends either of them had in the county. May Sutton, who ran the dry goods and had been quietly kind to Abigail since winter, and old Pete Granger, who'd worked the ranch for Colton's father and still stopped by occasionally to complain about the state of the territory and eat whatever was in the kitchen. It was not a large occasion. Abigail wore a dress that was better than her everyday clothes and not as fine as a wedding dress, and Colton wore his father's coat because it was the best thing he owned and because wearing it felt, on that particular day, like the right thing to do. The judge said the necessary words. They said the necessary words back. Pete Granger cried a little and was embarrassed about it, and May Sutton brought a cake that was good enough to make the awkwardness of the occasion feel beside the point. After the judge and the witnesses had gone, Colton and Abigail sat on the porch in the long June evening, the light going slowly in the way it does in summer at that latitude, reluctant and amber, and the cattle were visible in the south pasture moving in the easy way of animals in good condition, in good grass. "Pruitt's going to hear about this by tomorrow," Colton said. "Pruitt's already changed his opinion," Abigail said. "Has he?" "He asked me last month if we'd consider selling 2 of the spring calves to his brother-in-law outside of Cheyenne." She said it without satisfaction, which somehow made it more satisfying. "I told him we'd consider it for next year." Colton looked at the pasture. Gerald was visible at the far edge, already larger than the other yearlings, moving with the particular deliberate quality that good cattle have, like they know what they are. He thought about the letter under the coffee tin, which he'd finally thrown in the stove in March, the day they'd come back from Millhaven with the restructured note. He'd kept it for 4 months as a kind of ballast, the thing that reminded him how bad it could get. And then one morning it had seemed like the right thing to burn, not because the danger was entirely past, but because he'd decided he didn't need the reminder anymore. He had enough reasons to work without keeping fear on the shelf. What he had instead, on a shelf in the same kitchen, was 3 journals and a 4th one that Abigail had started in December. Her own record, in her small, even handwriting, of everything they'd learned together about this herd and this land and what it could become. She'd given it to him one evening in April without ceremony, just set it on the table beside the others. "Your father's records go up to 1886, she'd said. "Someone should keep going from there." He'd looked at the journal, at her handwriting in it, and he hadn't been able to say much of anything right then. He'd just put it with the others in the wooden crate, which was no longer under a stack of correspondence, but on a proper shelf in the kitchen where it could be reached easily, where anyone who needed to understand what this ranch was and how it worked could find it. That shelf was the thing he thought about sometimes when he tried to explain what had happened on the Hayes homestead in the winter of 1888. Not the calves, not the bank meeting, not the blizzard survived or the debt restructured or the buyers who came down the lane in spring with cash money and went away telling people the price was fair. The shelf, the journals, the record kept and continued. His father had built something here that he hadn't known how to read. He'd needed someone to read it with him, and then to keep reading it, and to add to it what she knew, and to insist that the thing his father had been building toward was worth protecting, even when every practical voice said otherwise. That was what Abigail Rowan had brought to the Hayes Ranch. And it was not the thing he'd asked for when he posted the advertisement. Not remotely. And it was more than he'd known to ask for, which is the way the most important things tend to arrive. You think you know what you need? You post your notice for a capable woman who can milk cows and help you not go under. What shows up is someone who reads 3 journals in one night and tells you what your father was trying to say. Years later, when the ranch had grown and Gerald had become the sire of a bloodline that spread across the territory, and the name Hayes was attached to cattle quality, the way some names get attached to things they've earned through patient work, a man came through Harlan Creek on his way to somewhere else and stopped at the ranch because he'd heard about it the way travelers hear about things, in pieces, from different people, each piece a little larger than the last. He stood at the fence for a while looking at the herd. Then he found Colton near the barn and asked him the question that people asked by then, the one about how he'd built it. Colton thought about how to answer, which he still did every time, because the honest answer was not simple. and the simple answer wasn't honest. Across the yard, Abigail was talking to two young men from the Eastern Range who'd ridden out to ask her advice on their breeding program. This happened regularly now, men who'd started out skeptical and had run out of reasons to stay that way. And she was pointing at something in the distance, probably explaining the pasture rotation she'd refined over 3 seasons. And she had her notebook in her coat pocket the way she always did, and her hair was coming loose at the side the way it always did by afternoon. And she looked exactly like what she was. Someone who had come to a failing place and decided it was worth saving and then done the specific, unglamorous, day-by-day work of saving it. "I hired her to milk the cows," Colton said to the man at the fence. The traveler waited for more. "She taught me how to read what my father built," Colton said, "and then she helped me finish it." He watched her across the yard. "That's the whole of it." It wasn't the whole of it, of course. The whole of it was 4 journals on a kitchen shelf and a restructured debt and 14 calves in a hard winter and a rooftop at 5 in the morning in a blizzard, and the specific quality of silence that develops between two people who have decided to trust each other with the same difficult thing. But some things you can't explain to a stranger at a fence. You can only point at what it produced and let them draw their own conclusions. What I've come to believe, thinking about people like Colton and Abigail and what they built in that Wyoming winter, is that we spend too much time waiting for the moment that looks like a beginning. We want the thing that announces itself clearly, the obvious opportunity, the unmistakable sign that this is the time to bet on something. But most real beginnings don't look like beginnings. They look like a desperate advertisement in a feed store, or a woman arriving with 2 worn bags and nothing proved yet, or an ordinary evening at a kitchen table with some old journals and the particular stubborn conviction that the thing in front of you is worth working for, even though every reasonable voice is saying otherwise. The frontier didn't reward the strongest or the richest, or the ones who'd been there the longest. What it rewarded, when it rewarded anything, was the ones who looked at what was actually there, not what it appeared to be on a bad day, not what the banker thought it was worth, not what the town said about it over a counter in November, and decided to build from that instead of walking away. That's not a lesson that belongs to 1888. It belongs to any morning when the thing you're working on looks harder than you have capacity for, and you go out and work on it anyway. Abigail Rowan showed up on a failing ranch and saw, in 3 notebooks and a wooden crate, what a man had spent his life building toward. She stayed not because the situation was promising, but because the thing underneath the difficulty was worth preserving. That is a kind of sight worth cultivating, not just on a ranch, not just in winter. Every day, in whatever you're building, look for what's actually there. Not what it seems on the surface, not what the easiest reading of it tells you, but what's underneath, in the record, in the work already done, in the thing that's been growing quietly in the wrong conditions and just needs someone to recognize it and refuse to let it go. The calves come in spring, but they survive because of what you did in February. That was the lesson of the Hayes Ranch, and Colton never forgot it, and neither did the woman who'd been hired to milk the cows.